So what I want to talk about today is something that hasn't gotten a lot of press in the presidential election, and it's something that is going to dog the next president, whoever wins next week, and that is about congressional oversight of intelligence, and in particular why it's been so troubled for so long. So let me start by just setting the table a little bit and give a little bit of background about what changes we've had in the executive branch since 9/11. Most of my work before this book really focused on the CIA and the FBI and why those agencies and other agencies in the executive branch and the intelligence community have had so many challenges in adapting to the rise of the terrorist threat. But what we see is that there's been tremendous change in the executive branch since 9/11. You can see on the slide above me the creation of the Office of the Director of National Intelligence, of John Negroponte, the first DNI is up there. We have the creation of the Department of Homeland Security, right? 22 different agencies, 200,000 people, one of the largest reorganizations in our government's history. We have, of course, the creation of fusion centers, which we may be talking about this afternoon, more than 70 of them across the United States. And of course, dramatic efforts by the FBI to try to transform itself from a law enforcement agency to a domestic intelligence agency. So tremendous effort at adaptation on the executive branch side. Now, as I often tell my own students, effort is not the same thing as improvement. And it's important to remember that lingering deficiencies remain. And we don't have to look too far to remember them. 2009, the underwear bomb plot. 2010, the Times Square plot. And almost exactly 3 years ago today, the Fort Hood terrorist attack, which killed 13 Americans, the worst terrorist attack on American soil since 9/11. And it's a project I've been looking into the Fort Hood attack for the past 2 years. So, but the overall picture, despite these attacks and plots and despite continued vulnerabilities, the overall picture of the executive branch is a feverish effort to create new organizations, to transform existing organizations, to adapt to this rising terrorist threat. But Congress is a very different story, right? The persistence of congressional intelligence oversight weaknesses has gotten almost no attention, either in the press or in the academic debate. And it's not because intelligence oversight is working well. Since the end of the Cold War, there have been a number of different studies from blue ribbon commissions, independent task forces, and even Congress itself that have called for improvements of intelligence oversight. Now, I had the very bizarre experience a few years ago of being asked to testify at a Senate Select Committee on Intelligence hearing about the Senate Select Committee on Intelligence. The committee was holding a hearing about itself. Now, you know things are bad when a congressional committee is holding a hearing about itself and how it could improve its own oversight over the intelligence community. At the same time, it was a fairly courageous thing for a congressional committee to do, to actually lay bare its weaknesses and ask outsiders what their perspectives were. That was the seed of this book project, was that hearing. Yet despite the hearing, despite all of these reports, despite a number of recommendations for reform, Congress has done almost nothing to improve its oversight of the intelligence community in any significant way. Now, my last book I wrote, I actually did the masochistic task of tracking every intelligence reform recommendation of the 1990s and what happened to them. And one of the most remarkable things and surprising things I found was of the 340 intelligence reform recommendations, you won't be surprised to know that almost none of them were implemented. But the organization that had a 0 implementation rate, not a single reform recommendation that was implemented, was not the CIA, it wasn't the National Security Agency, it wasn't the FBI, it was the US Congress, right? A perfect failure rate when it came to implementing recommended reforms in the 10 years before 9/11. So the question then is why? Why has congressional oversight been such a problem for so long? Or more precisely, why do we find a consistent pattern of faltering oversight over the intelligence community despite lots of changes in the inputs to oversight? So we have different presidents, we have divided government, we have uniform government, we have different leaders of the congressional committees. So despite a changing cast of characters, despite increasing urgency of intelligence issues, despite changes of who occupies the White House, we still have this thing called problematic intelligence oversight. Why is that the case? That's a really interesting question from a political science perspective. And from a policy perspective, it's a very important question, because it suggests when you have inputs that are changing and outputs that aren't, that we have some entrenched barriers to improvement. Now, the conventional wisdom, why do we have this problem with oversight, blames the executive branch. And in particular, the executive branch's penchant for secrecy and claims of expansive executive authority. Now, there's this old joke when Bill Casey was CIA director in the Reagan administration that he wouldn't tell you if your coat was on fire unless you asked him explicitly, right? So there is something to this secrecy argument. Even after 9/11, one congressional staffer told me when I was researching this book, and I quote, "The silver lining with the FBI is that at least they're nonpartisan in their non-cooperation with Congress." I interviewed another former intelligence officer who recounted to me the very delicate task of briefing the intelligence committees about the secret destruction of nearly 100 videotapes of detainees. You might have remembered them in the press, using harsh interrogation methods. And here's what this former intelligence officer said, and I quote, "I went to the Hill and told them the tapes no longer existed. Now, I said they no longer existed. I did not say we crushed them up. It was up to them to figure it out, but I did not bury it." This gives you a sense of the delicate dance of what briefing the Hill means. So it's certainly true that executive branch secrecy is an important part of the story, but it's not the only part of the story. And what I found is it may not even be the most important part of the story. That Congress's most serious oversight deficiencies have to do with Congress more than the executive branch, and that's what we haven't paid enough attention to and what I want to talk to you about today. Now, what I find is that there are two institutional deficiencies in particular, and you see them on the left-hand side of the slide. Limited expertise in Congress and weak budgetary power. Right? So knowledge and money, two big levers of oversight of any policy domain. And in the intelligence realm, Congress lacks the expertise and has even developed rules and practices to prevent the development of expertise in Congress as an institution. In terms of weak budgetary power, the intelligence committees have not been able to wield this fundamental power of the purse and intelligence nearly as much as other congressional committees have, and I'll get into more of the comparison in a bit. And these two deficiencies, in turn, have existed for so long because Congress has very powerful incentives to keep it that way. This is not a story of partisanship. It's not a story of personalities or individuals. It's a story of how the incentives for every member of Congress lead to a dysfunctional oversight system. And those incentives have to do with election and the dirtiest four-letter word in Washington, which is turf, right? Congressional committees fighting for their own turf. And so the upshot is that Congress has very powerful reasons to tie its own hands in congressional oversight of intelligence, even when the national security stakes are high, even now more than 10 years after 9/11. Well, let me take a step back and ask for a minute, what on earth does good oversight look like anyway? How do we know it when we see it? I couldn't believe my good fortune in finding a Charlie Brown cartoon that actually talks about lobbyists and Congress. And I put that cartoon up there because it illustrates one of the critical problems with how do we know good oversight when we see it. One of the critical problems is good oversight lies in the eye of the beholder. What are optimal oil drilling regulations is you're going to get a different answer from British Petroleum than you're going to get from the Sierra Club, right? So it's very hard from an objective perspective to define good oversight, because good oversight is intertwined with the reality of politics and the representation of interests. Now, in addition to this problem, we have the issue that most agencies in the executive branch have conflicting mandates from the beginning. So the Forest Service was originally designed in part to facilitate timber mining on public lands. And now it's also supposed to make it possible for all of us to visit these public lands as well, conflicting missions. The Department of Homeland Security, many of you know better than I do, has a mission both to keep terrorists out and let other people in to the United States. So tension between these missions, which complicates how we think about oversight. And then there's this problem that oversight is hard to measure. A lot of congressional oversight is informal. It's the telephone call, the email, the coffee, things that you can't put on a spreadsheet or some of the pretty graphs that I'm going to show you all. So I acknowledge all of these problems. Oversight is challenging. But what I found when I interviewed more than 80 different people, members of Congress and their staffs, members of the intelligence community, at all different levels, was that they actually agreed on 4 major roles, ideally, that congressional oversight should perform. And you may be surprised with some of them. We'll see. The first role is the policeman role. It's the most obvious one. Good oversight means ensuring that executive branch agencies are following the law, right? That's pretty straightforward. The second role is what I call the board of directors role. If Congress is doing its job well, it sets strategic guidance for agencies and it helps them to figure out how to match resources against their priorities. The third role is a coach, to constantly be helping these agencies look for ways to continue to improve everything that they do. And the fourth role, which was really, in my mind, one of the more surprising ones, and came from interviews with intelligence officials, is the ambassadorial role. And here's, to paraphrase what one intelligence official told me, we work in secret agencies. We rely on Congress more than any other kinds of agencies to generate that public trust, because we can't tell the public what we're doing. Congress is the only part of the government that can be our ambassador to the American people and ensure that we are supported in a democracy in the types of activities that we do. So agreement on all 4 of these roles. Some people emphasized some of them more than others. But one of the amazing things I found was that almost everyone I interviewed agreed that oversight in all of these roles was bad and getting worse. Right. Now, there are a few metrics. I'm a political scientist, so I always like to use metrics where I can. There are a few metrics that support these general observations from the interviews that I had. How do you measure what Congress is doing? Well, you look at how many hearings they hold on an issue, and you look at what legislation is being produced. That's a pretty good proxy for attention to some issues. So let me share with you a little bit of what I found. What this slide shows is every 5 years from 1985 to 2005, I tracked the number of hearings held by 15 different congressional committees. This is just the data for the House. So Intelligence Committee hearings, how many were held in these years versus other committee hearings for the same year. And what you see is that the red column at the far right of each of these, those are the Intelligence Committee hearings. And you can see that the Intelligence Committee holds far fewer hearings than other committees every year that I sampled. And that was true on the Senate side every year but one. And not just a few fewer hearings, but dramatically fewer hearings. So the House Intelligence Committee on average held 24 hearings a year, and the Foreign Relations Committee held more than 100. And by the way, I'm counting both classified closed hearings and open hearings, so total number of hearings per year. So not a lot of activity on the intelligence side compared to other committees in Congress. I found a similar trend if you looked at legislative productivity coming out of the intelligence committees versus other committees. Even if you took committees that weren't regulatory committees, because you'd expect regulatory committees to come up with lots of laws, the intelligence committees rate pretty low. In fact, this will tell you just how low they do rate. In terms of overall productivity, what percentage of congressional legislation was produced by the intelligence committees over a 20-year period? The only committee that produced less was the ethics committee, right? So when you're just slightly above the ethics committee, things are not working out so well for you. So this is a pretty good indicators that congressional oversight is not working well, even though it's hard to define. Problematic oversight is a reasonable place to start. So the next thing I did was I decided to look at, if you looked at the two key weapons that Congress can use in oversight, how do they differ in intelligence compared to other policy areas? And those two key weapons were expertise and money. So let me go through what I found about expertise. Obviously, it's intuitively appealing to think the more a congressional committee knows about a policy area, the better questions it can ask, the better oversight it can conduct, right? Because it's knowledgeable about that policy area. Now, there are three basic ways that a committee can develop expertise. You can have homegrown expertise. People walk in the door an expert because that's how they ran for office, and they have that expertise in their head when they come. You can learn it on the job, and in Congress, this is incentivized. You get on-the-job learning if you have committees that enable you to stay on the committee for a long time and reward seniority. Or you can outsource that expertise, right? You can to your staff. Or I tried to keep my acronyms to a minimum on my slides, but CBO, the Congressional Budget Office, Congressional Research Service, or the Government Accountability Office. You can bolster those capabilities so that Congress's own organizations then have the ability to dig into what the intelligence agencies are doing. Right? So three ways to get expertise. And if you look on the right-hand side of the slide, it turns out intelligence is suffering in all three of those routes to expertise, right? Expertise is far more robust in other policy areas than in intelligence. Take homegrown expertise. Almost nobody walks in the door an intelligence expert to Congress. I recently checked the current Congress. Of the 535 members in Congress today, anyone want to guess how many ever worked in an intelligence agency before? Two. Mike Rogers, chairman of the House Permanent Select Committee on Intelligence, and Michael Grimm, both of them former FBI agents, 2 out of 535, right? In the Armed Services Committees, to give you a point of comparison, about a third of the members typically have prior experience in the military. Now, understanding intelligence, if you're not an expert, takes the one thing in shortest supply for a member of Congress: time. Right? Now, this homegrown expertise problem is exacerbated by inattentive voters and weak interest groups. Ever since the 1950s, political scientists have been looking at how people vote for their member of Congress and for the president. And foreign policy has never been the #1 issue in a presidential election, at least as far back as I can see, going back to the 1980s. And in fact, in the 1996 and 2000 elections, foreign policy ranked dead last. So foreign policy junkies can take heart that there was a foreign policy debate, but coming out of the polls next week, it's unlikely that foreign policy is going to be the #1 issue that voters talk about, right? So voters don't care much about foreign policy in general when it comes time to vote. They care even less about the nitty-gritty aspects of the intelligence community when it comes time to vote, and they really care a lot less about those things when they're voting for their member of Congress, right? In addition to that, we have very few and weak interest groups in intelligence. So I actually looked at the number of interest groups in intelligence. There are 25,189 interest groups across all issues, and of them, only about 4% were concerned with foreign policy broadly. Even fewer of them focused on intelligence. So there aren't a lot of incentives for the average representative or senator to focus on intelligence issues because voters don't care, right? Even I'm not going to vote for my representative to Congress based on his views of the FBI's personnel system, right? Voters don't care, and interest groups are not very plentiful or powerful in intelligence. So that's homegrown expertise. On-the-job learning. Well, there too, Congress has actually tied its own hands by instituting term limits in the intelligence committees, but almost nowhere else. So 90% of Congress's committees actually allow unlimited service. But the intelligence committees, since the 1970s, have limited service on them to just a few terms. Now, term limits were abolished on the Senate Intelligence Committee a few years ago, but they still exist in the House, which means that just when a representative understands all the acronyms of the 17 agencies in the U.S. intelligence community, that person has to roll off the Intelligence Committee onto a different committee, just when they get to be expert. Why does this matter? Well, let me show you in graphic terms why this matters. This is a comparison, what you see, of 3 different committees, and what I did was I looked at long-termers. And long-termers I define as people who serve 10 years or more. Okay? So the idea is that the longer they're there, the more they know, the better questions they can ask, the better the oversight. Right? House Armed Services Committee, about 1/3 of the membership were long-termers. They were there 10 years or more. Banking Committee, about 1/4 of the membership were long-termers. But look at the House Intelligence Committee. Because of term limits, only 5% of those members served 10 years or more by rolling off the committee, rolling back on. The real picture is probably worse than that because I'm looking only at long-termers back from 1975 to 2008. The intelligence committees were created in the 1970s. So you could have people in the Armed Services Committee that served before 1975 serving all the way through. Right? So pretty significant gap in expertise. Now, in one of the worst years and highest turnover years for the House Intelligence Committee, 11 out of 19 members, 11 of 19 were brand new to the committee. It's hard to conduct rigorous oversight when you have 11 out of 19 members who have never learned the acronyms of the intelligence community before. Former CIA Director Mike Hayden put it to me as only Mike Hayden can put it. He said, "Term limits are stupid. I don't know why they still have them, but they are hanging themselves." Right? So that's on-the-job learning. The third route to expertise is outsourcing to staff. And there we have a pretty mixed picture. Intelligence Committee staffs have grown, but not as much as other committee staffs have. And in more recent years, there has been some movement to letting the Government Accountability Office actually get involved with auditing and investigating intelligence agencies. But that's still very much a work in progress. So that's expertise. Now, the second powerful weapon that Congress can wield is the power of the purse. Now, what Lee Hamilton said in that 2007 committee hearing that the Senate Intelligence Committee held about itself, this is what Lee Hamilton said. "All of us have to live by the golden rule, and the golden rule is that he who controls the gold makes the rules." Right? Money counts in Washington. Now, Congress's budget power has, since our founding, been handled in a 2-step process. There are committees that are called authorizing committees that examine agency activities, and then there are appropriations committees that fund those activities. Now, nearly all of Congress's committees are authorizing committees. Appropriations, or paying the bills, are handled only by the subcommittees of the Appropriations Committee in the House and the Senate. Now, this design was intended to encourage expertise, right? So the idea was that some members of Congress would be substantive policy experts, serving on the authorizing committees, and others would be fiscal policy experts, guardians of the Treasury, serving on the appropriations committees. But this system has also, over time, developed into a bifurcated system where coordination is required in order to get programs funded. It also, this bifurcated system ensures that if you're on the authorizing committee, which an intelligence committee is, your power only goes so far. You can threaten to cut someone's budget if they don't do what you suggest, but you can't deliver on that threat. You need the appropriators over here to deliver on that threat. And agencies know this, and they have an incentive to game the system, appealing to the appropriators if they don't get what they want from the intelligence committees. It's what I call the two-parent theory of budgetary politics. If mom says no, go to dad, right? This is what the intelligence community does. If the authorizing committee says no, the appropriators might say yes. Now, two key factors should actually make this end run around the intelligence committees less likely: the availability of information and lower workloads. Right? The more information you have available, the lower the workloads of these committees, the more they can work together. They get the information's out there, they understand what the issues are, and they can work across committee lines. Well, it turns out that in intelligence, just like expertise, we have a much harder problem with information and with workloads than we have in other domestic policy issues. So for most policy issues, information is public and widely available, right? It's the unclassified world. We have legislators, their staffs, lobbyists, interest groups, members of the public who can easily access people, budget information, programmatic information, what the agencies are doing. Interest groups in particular can funnel information to members of Congress at low cost to the members themselves. But if you look at the intelligence side, it's a very different information environment. The classified world means that budget details are not available to the general public. They're not even available to interest groups. They're not available to most people. They're not available to most staffers. Very few congressional staffers hold security clearances. And in the Senate, even clearances aren't enough. Senate rules designate that intelligence committee information is committee sensitive, meaning that if you're the personal staffer to a senator on the Intelligence Committee, you are not going to get access to everything that someone, even if you have the same level of clearance, that someone who's working on the committee has access to. Members of Congress can read classified documents, but they have to do so in a secured facility. And if you have to leave your office to go do your homework, the odds are lower that you're going to do your homework. And that is, in fact, what has happened. Secrecy rules are designed, of course, to protect sensitive information, and they're there for a reason. But what they do is they also give the executive branch tremendous informational advantage. Remember the end game. The more the executive branch knows compared to Congress, the easier it is to bypass the intelligence committees and go right to the appropriations committees. So that's the information environment. And then we have something called the budget workload. Now, our budgets are getting more constrained across the board, but it's fair to say that the defense budget workload is going to be significantly larger than other areas for some time to come. There are a lot of numbers on this chart. I just want to point out one. And it's the big one at the top, $636.3 billion. That was the fiscal year 2010 defense appropriations budget. That budget is a monster. It is dramatically higher, right? Think workload, much higher workload for this subcommittee that's dealing with the defense budget than any other appropriations subcommittee. It's 3 times higher than the second-ranked subcommittee on that list. It's 6 times higher or greater than the third committee ranking on that list, the Veterans Affairs Committee. And it's 10 times bigger, that workload, 10 times bigger than all of the other appropriations subcommittees. So you've got now this Defense Appropriations Subcommittee that is overtaxed and overburdened with this behemoth defense appropriations budget. And the intelligence budget is in that giant budget, right? So it doesn't get a lot of time. So remember, we have information that's not very available, and now a dramatic workload disparity between the defense budget and other budgets. So the upshot of all of this is that end runs in intelligence are much more likely than they are in other policy areas because the workloads are higher and the information is not available. Now, this isn't a theoretical problem that I dreamed up at Hoover Tower at Stanford University. It's a real problem that's actually happened several times. And let me give you an example. So much of this is classified, but we got a really interesting and rare glimpse into the classified fight in 2004. when Senator Jay Rockefeller took the very unusual step of going on the floor of the Senate and complaining in vague terms about a classified satellite program, believed to be the MISTY satellite program, that he had serious objections to. And as you see from the New York Times article about the program, it was estimated to cost $9.5 billion, which is almost double what it was supposed to cost, and could only take pictures in daylight and in clear weather. So this is not an ideal satellite program. Now, what Rockefeller objected to was the fact that the Intelligence Committee on the Senate had voted twice on a bipartisan basis to kill this program. And what happened? And run around the Intelligence Committee, appropriators funded it anyway. So Rockefeller was so incensed by this, he went to the floor of the Senate and he registered his objection, and guess what happened? The program got funded for 3 more years anyway. It wasn't killed until 2007 by then Director of National Intelligence, Michael McConnell. So end runs happen. This is only one example of an end run. I know of at least 2 other major satellite programs from the interviews that I conducted where the exact same thing happened, spending billions of dollars that didn't need to be spent on programs that experts thought were not very effective. So then the question, of course, arises, well, why don't we fix these budgetary problems? Why have budgetary reform? We know that these problems exist. Why have they lingered for so long? Well, like expertise, Congress's budgetary weaknesses have been the subject of numerous reports and recommendations, none of which have gone very far. Just to give you a couple of examples, the Hart-Rudman Commission, the most extensive examination of national security since World War II, which issued its reports in the late 90s and 2001. Hart-Rudman Commission recommended fixing this bifurcated system by giving the Intelligence Committee's appropriations powers as well. The 9/11 Commission also recommended consolidating authorizing powers and appropriations powers in the intelligence committees. But resolutions to actually grant the intelligence committees these powers have failed 3 times in the Senate and have never come before a vote in the House. And for the reasons you can expect, turf and reelection incentives. The current split between the authorizers and the appropriators maintains Congress's internal distribution of power. I know many of you are involved in Homeland Security, and it will be of no surprise to you to know that there were, before 9/11, 88 different committees and subcommittees that had some oversight responsibility for Homeland Security matters. Now, so many years after 9/11, that number has declined to 86. Right? Members of Congress fight to keep their turf, and nobody fights harder than Senate appropriators. In fact, as one of my interviewees said to me, in Congress you have to understand there are Democrats, there are Republicans, and then there are appropriators. So turf is a major reason why we haven't seen a realignment of this budgetary authority. And there are also electoral benefits that members get by serving on the appropriations committees. They get disproportionate benefits to their districts back home. So people who serve on the Appropriations Subcommittee for Defense tend to have, not surprisingly, a lot of military installations in their districts, right? So even in this type of committee, which is considered a duty committee in Congress, you get electoral benefits by serving on it. So let me end with a couple of depressing and concluding thoughts. I'll start with the good news, which is that there are some fixes that are possible, that we don't have to think hard and long to figure out some immediate steps that Congress could take without even passing legislation to improve intelligence oversight. The first is to abolish term limits on the House Intelligence Committee to try to encourage the development of longer-term expertise. And soon we'll have enough years that have passed between the abolition of term limits in the Senate to really compare the effects of no term limits in the Senate and term limits in the House. And I think we're going to find a pretty dramatic difference between the two. So abolishing term limits in the House could be done without legislation, could be done immediately. Consolidating budgetary power is a second obvious step and recommended for a long time, as I mentioned. And third, bolstering staff capabilities, both within these committee staffs and utilizing more organizations like the Government Accountability Office to improve the performance of the intelligence community. And now here's the bad news. All of these good ideas are probably unlikely to come to pass, because if what I've argued is right, the barriers to reform are entrenched. They're systemic. They have to do with what motivates members of Congress to win re-election and what motivates them to guard their power in the committees they have. And so those are unlikely to change anytime soon. So on that rather depressing note, I will stop there. Thank you.
By the way, incredible, insightful comments as always. But you did mention in the beginning fusion centers. And I'm sure we have some representatives of fusion centers in here, if not one of the first ones in the United States, the Joint Regional Intelligence Center down the road, which in fact we at CREATE are involved in a project with. I think it's been quite successful, but there are some people back on the Hill who don't feel that way. They think that they are ineffective. They think they've been unproductive. What's your assessment of the fusion center model in the United States right now?
Well, I think that, can you hear me? Yeah, good. I think that the problem with that report, and it is a withering report of fusion centers, is it cuts with one big knife. It lumps all the fusion centers together. And I know from having been to the JRIC here that there are some fusion centers that are doing great work. The problem is that there's a tendency to add that more is better, right? When in doubt, create a new agency. And so we've had a proliferation, not just fusion centers, but a number of different organizations involved in domestic homeland security. And so if you think, as I do, that the critical problem before 9/11 was coordination, creating more organizations exacerbates in many cases those coordination problems. So do we have too many fusion centers? Do we have the right mix of fusion centers? I think those are questions. The architecture of the domestic intelligence picture is what that committee really should have focused on, and they didn't do that. And so I read this report, and it is just blistering that, against the fusion centers. And then you go to the recommendations, and what are the recommendations? It's about spending money better. They didn't tackle the architecture. What they did was basically say we spent too much money on the carpeting without, right, which is essentially what it boils down to, without asking the question, how do we do domestic intelligence for homeland security in this country? What is working with the fusion center model? What isn't? And how do we get from here to there? And that was what disappointed me about that report. So I think we should build on the fusion centers, but I think there's some merit to what the report was saying, but it didn't do the job.
Thank you. Thank you.
Our first question, yes. I happen to be an admirer of Senator Dianne Feinstein. I followed her career for years, and I stand up when I'm watching her fight for things which seem to be intransigent. My question is, have you interviewed Dianne, and is she fighting for the very things that you propose to make her work? She, I believe, is the head of the Intelligence Committee in the Senate. Have you done this?
So I've interviewed a number of people on the Hill, and most of my interviewees have asked to remain confidential so that they can speak candidly. But I will say this, which is that I agree with you that I think she's a remarkable senator. We're very lucky to have her in California. But what I'm arguing about intelligence oversight is that even with a great chairwoman of a committee, she can only go so far because she doesn't have the budgetary weapon that she needs, and she doesn't have the expertise of all the members of her committee to wield the power of that committee effectively. So her hands are tied, much like her predecessors' hands have been tied. And so even if you get someone who is dedicated as she is to intelligence, by the way, which doesn't really serve her electoral interests particularly well, right, that she can't do the job because Congress is designed in ways that make it difficult.
Okay, next question. Yes, Indira.
Just had a question about, I guess, the congressional hearings that you were talking about. So I just noticed in the graph that you had that just since the 80s, just hearings overall have gone down significantly. And even though intelligence hearings are really low, it seems sort of constant. And I don't know if it's sort of grasping at straws that that's the case, or if that's maybe a positive thing, or if there's, or if it's, like I said, sort of grasping at straws that it hasn't gone down.
Yeah, so it's an interesting pattern, as you point out, that the number of intelligence hearings is roughly the same there's some blips, but roughly the same. Not even that dramatic an increase right after 9/11 when there was the joint inquiry into 9/11. Why would that be the case? Some people on the Hill say, well, you don't know all of the other oversight activities we're doing, so there's a lot more other activity, briefings, meetings, phone calls, and the like. And so that underrepresents an increase in congressional oversight. So that is possible. But to me, the other interesting thing, which I didn't put in this slide, but I've been looking into this week, and Scott Shane in the New York Times may be writing about it at the end of this week, is the number of open hearings versus closed hearings. So it turns out, it feels like there are more closed hearings that are not available to the public today, but if you actually look at the data, most hearings have been closed over time. So only about 15% of Congress's hearings in a given year on intelligence are open to the public. So you do the math, it's 20-something hearings, it's about 3 open hearings a year, aside from confirmation hearings in the Senate. That's not very many, right? And if you think of hearings as a way to alert the American people to threats that we should be concerned about, to educate the American people while protecting sources and methods about the threats that face our country, those hearings play a vital role. So you think about those presidential debates, not one question on cybersecurity. That was true in 2008. And you know what? If you look at the intelligence threat assessment, the annual threat assessment from the Director of National Intelligence in 2008, cyber was in there. If you look at the threat assessment for this year, cyber's number 3, right? So I think Congress needs to, I think that open hearings play an important role in informing the public about threats, and they could do much more if they thought about it that way and conducted more of them.
Everybody for Libya?
Sure.
So one of the conversations that Amy and I have often is the fact that we live in a country, unfortunately, that's buoyed by tragedy of the proportion of Hurricane Sandy and elation when we have the Olympics every 4 years, and in between there's a constant turf war. Unfortunately, we are in a community that gets to transcend all of that, called a national security community, that despite partisan politics really is encouraged and focused on the security of this nation. Recently, and Amy knows, I can say this now, I was supposed to be in Libya the week before the unfortunate event happened in Benghazi. And there are allegations now that there was intelligence that was known, information that was made public about the security situation there, even as far as allegations now that the administration is involved in a cover-up. I'm going to ask you just very candidly, as I always do, your insights and your opinions of what we're hearing about and whether there's any truth to it.
Yeah, as you know, I'm a relentlessly nonpartisan person. I try to be. I think there's plenty of insight and criticism to go around in both parties. In this case, I think there's no evidence whatsoever of a cover-up, and I think this is the wrong conversation that the country needs to be having. And I think, and Condi Rice was on Fox News actually defending the Obama administration on this score. And to suggest, for any campaign to suggest that the president would knowingly cover up intelligence about the death of an American ambassador and 3 other Americans who were serving is offensive. And it also suggests a fundamental misreading of intelligence and what it does. And I often talk about this, that intelligence is in a catch-22. If you have an intelligence report or an estimate that says at one point in time, this is what we believe, and then you get new information and you say, you know what, we've changed our judgment based on this new information, now you're criticized because you were wrong before. And that, I think, is what's happening in the Benghazi case, which is that this information is fluid, it's coming at you fast, they're trying to get to the bottom of it. Those first reports are almost always wrong. And there hasn't been, again, this education of intelligence is not this crystal ball that says, now we know at minute 1 that this is exactly what happened. It's murky, it's contradictory, it's messy, and that is, I think, what's going on with Benghazi. And I know we talked a little bit about this. There is an important policy issue related to the Libya attack, but the Romney campaign hasn't raised this issue. And that issue is, what is the Obama administration's view on the war on terror. Are we actually on a path to strategic defeat, which is what the Secretary of Defense said a few months ago, is what the President has said, or has al-Qaeda and its affiliates and associates regenerated in a way that causes us to rethink what we should be doing? That's the serious intelligence and counterterrorism debate that the Libya attack should be raising, and instead they're talking about who said what in the Rose Garden, which I think is not productive.
Okay. I saw a hand in the back earlier. Yes, Heather.
Even recognizing some of the reforms which you optimistically say probably won't occur, it sounds like you're talking about so many fundamental institutional roadblocks to Congress being an effective mechanism for oversight. So do you think that the solution can even come from the legislative branch? And what do you think about some proposals that have existed to create other mechanisms like a civilian body that oversees intelligence as a more effective mechanism?
So I didn't share with you my one more optimistic view, which is that I think Congress can in some ways outsource more than it has the oversight function, not necessarily to a civilian board, but to inspectors general, right? And so we see this movement, and I don't know whether it's deliberate on Congress's part, but we see an empowerment of inspectors general, both within agencies and now across the, the DNI. And that is a hybrid model that poses some promise, I think, because the incentive is then to report to Congress and to work within these agencies to not only look at wrongdoing, but to look at how to improve their effectiveness. So I think inspectors general could be a very useful workaround. It's not a substitute for congressional oversight, but it could be a useful complement to weaknesses or compensation for weaknesses in congressional oversight. But let me just raise one other question, which is a little bit closer to home, which is how do we think about oversight of state and local officials conducting what are increasingly federal intelligence functions, NYPD, LAPD. Regardless of where you sit on the civil liberties security side, it seems to me that having a robust oversight process benefits you. If you're concerned about civil liberties, that's helpful. If you're concerned about that you're going to have political officials who aren't going to protect you when controversies arise, having an institutionalized oversight capability is helpful. But we've had this development of really important intelligence activities going on at the state and local level, critical intelligence activities, and we haven't thought through how those should be overseen, right? How does that work in a way that empowers our local officials to do their jobs well and also protects civil liberties? And so I think that's an area of oversight that's been understudied and underexamined.
Yes, Javier?
Hi, I had a question about people who have said that they were radicalized, and I know that a couple of them have actually been, whereas others, there's some problems with their stories and things like that, and I wonder how that affects certain intelligence committees, if their insight is taken into.
I didn't hear the last part.
If their insight is taken into account. Like, I've heard that they've done some certain trainings in like Homeland Security and whatnot.
Could you kindly repeat the question so some of us who can't hear can now know?
So, Gary, I think, again, help me. You're talking about a group of people that have claimed to be radicalized.
Yeah, like.
And claim to have received some training.
Yeah.
Here.
Overseas.
Overseas,
Yeah.
and may be here.
Yeah.
Okay. And how does that affect the intelligence
Gathering.
communities?
Yeah, intelligence gathering, intelligence agencies.
I mean, in terms of their activities subsequent to hearing that kind of information?
Yeah.
And that it might be ongoing?
Yeah, how they decipher between what they think is correct or not.
So how do you decipher between what's just information, what might be actionable intelligence?
Yeah.
Yeah, that's a tough question. I mean, that's the gist of dealing with any human source in intelligence, right? Is what are their motives? What is their credibility? What other sources do I have that can either increase my confidence or lower my confidence in that source's, what that source is telling me? So I think that's a generalizable intelligence problem that is particularly acute in this setting. So it's something that the intelligence community has to grapple with on a host of different issues. If we're hearing things about Iran's nuclear weapons program, why are scientists telling us these things, right? This deception and counterintelligence are critical issues across the full spectrum of threats to the United States.
Michael?
You mentioned that there were 22 agencies underneath the DHS umbrella. Do you believe that inhibits their ability to function, to do their job?
By the other book.
Yeah, Meryl says buy the other book. I'm of two minds. On the one hand, I think that the one face at the border rationale for consolidating agencies made a lot of intuitive sense. That I know many of you were involved in port security. I remember right after 9/11, I did a bit of work at the port. And one of the things that struck me that Peter Neffinger said was that we have things coming in the port and we have people coming in the port. And we have different systems and different agencies for each of those. And so reconciling those, making it easier to work across those systems and those agency lines is an important improvement. Now, on the intelligence side, I think the creation of DHS has complicated the domestic intelligence picture. Remember, when DHS was created, there was not a lot of focus on intelligence reform because it was too hard. That was the can that got kicked down the road. And so how do we reconcile DHS, FBI, and state and local officials in domestic intelligence with national security implications has never really been resolved. And that's a critical, what is DHS supposed to do in intelligence, right? It couldn't task intelligence collection. And now we have NCTC, and how do those pieces fit together? So I think the intelligence side of that equation is still very much a work in progress. But the border protection side, and you can speak to this better than I do, seems to me to be working much better.
Absolutely. And I don't want to dominate, but you're absolutely correct. And I would say to that, again, Amy does, I'll be the marketer here. She does a fantastic job in her book, Spying Blind, talking about those organizational challenges that we had before the creation of DHS and subsequent to DHS, where you had some agencies that arguably may have been maybe somewhat dysfunctional, and now putting them all together under one umbrella and assuming that that would make them more efficient, it hasn't. And she's right, the intelligence piece was one that really just did not get addressed, and unfortunately we're grappling with it. So, Alonzo.
Fortunately, due to our educational system at the primary school level and the high school level, how are we going to address this intelligence capacity? Grooming our young kids to study and major in national security in colleges and become experts so then they can run for Congress or work on the staff in Congress. How are we going to address that issue?
Yeah, it's a great question. So one of the things I did is I actually looked at top 25 universities ranked by U.S. News and World Report. How many of them offer any undergraduate classes on intelligence? The answer is a handful, 6 or 7, depending on the year. More than twice that number offer courses on the history of rock and roll, right? So, which I love that stat because it enables me to say that your kids, if they're in college, have a better chance of learning about U2 the band than U2 the spy plane, right? So this is a problem not just, so I've put a lot of criticism on Congress and the executive branch, but we in the academy need to be doing a much better job of offering classes, of educating people, of publishing in this area. And I can tell you that the incentives for academics are actually very low to focus on intelligence issues because it's considered not theoretical enough. And it's always been considered a side kind of sideline territory for mainstream theoretical abstract political science. This has got to change. Now, increasingly, I see some interest on the part of the intelligence community to have scholars in residence and people like that, which is an improvement, but it requires faculty to really work together. And there is more movement, I think, in the academic world that this is an important area to cover. But I'll give you one other statistic, which is if you look at the top 3 journals in political science and you add up all the articles, academic articles that faculty have written since 9/11, it's something like 2,000. Only 2 have focused on intelligence issues. So we have this enormous disconnect between the issues that are of crucial importance in the public policy world and what our leading political scientists are thinking about. And that needs to change. And it changes slowly, and it changes through networks, and it changes by starting at great universities and offering those classes because people then want to replicate what they see at the leading universities.
Okay, we'll take one more.
I do understand that the 17 intelligence agencies primarily operate in classified world, and I think everybody knows that. But it's actually Congress who actually passes the budget for those 17 intelligence agencies to operate. And say, for example, I mean, FBI is a great organization. If it is, in fact, $8 billion a year organization, is there any hope for Congress to ask any one of these 17 intelligence agencies for some amount of transparency or accountability as to how they're spending their money? And I mean, is it for intelligence reform? Is it for intelligence feed? Is the Congress asking those specific questions as to how they're spending their money?
It's hard for Congress to ask those questions because, again, you get the defense appropriations budget. The intelligence budget's less than 10% of that budget. So to the extent that Congress is asking questions, it's on programs like the Joint Strike Fighter, which is a much bigger ticket item than individual agency budgets in the intelligence community. The good news with all of our fiscal crisis is that fiscal crisis generates the need for innovation. So as the budgets get tighter, people inside these agencies have a much stronger incentive to think about how to innovate, how to do more with less, where to invest, where not to invest. And so if Congress is savvy and partners smartly with these agencies, we can avoid these across-the-board cuts and have a much more strategic focus on where our intelligence community should be improving and where we should be letting some things go.